and then we'll make a start. James, anything you want to say as people are joining? Do you want to say hello?
No, that was well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. But yeah, that was a very good point to raise that we have a lot of config we want to dive into and explore the use cases and the whys and the hows. But yeah, we also have a backlog of basically a wish list of things we'd like to show towards the back end, but we'll be very aware of time and also of people asking questions. That's one thing we're really hoping that you guys do on this. Ask us as many questions as you can, because if we don't get a chance to answer them just on our natural discourse, we'll try and stop the webinar at certain points and cover those use cases. And if not that, we'll be able to copy some answers into our knowledge base for you to watch later on in your own time as well.
Yeah, certainly. I would definitely suggest throw out, just ask a question. If there's any question you have on your mind, even if it's unrelated to what we're showing, please ask it, and we'll still try and get to that depending on how many questions we have coming in. So we're just going to give it a few more moments, and then we will kick off with this one. I do apologize in advance if my voice starts to change as we go through this. I have a rather sore throat, but hopefully James will help me out with some of the talking throughout.
Yeah,
excellent. James, I'm going to say let's just make a start. People will still be joining probably for the next minute or so, but they'll be able to pick this up. So where are we at today? This is after the form. In our last session, we discussed intake forms, and we started building out a whole bunch of things here. And today we're just going to really continue that theme with our take control pillar. So as you know, we've already done the visibility pillar, repository using data, custom data. We're now very much in the take control pillar, which largely focuses on workflows. And we've predominantly focused on the vendor side at the moment. So just as a reminder, and coming back to our last session, the best practice method here is that all of your new processes should really start from an intake form within Gatekeeper. And I was kind of nerding out with James earlier on about this. And the way we kind of see it is that intake form gets you all the data you need. And that data then goes into your repository, which fuels all your other workflows, sort of those post-signature workflows, your contract renewals, things like that. And that helps you automate all of your compliance elements. So intake, workflows, good data, leads to good compliance. It kind of all works within these three pillars that James has on screen for you here. So as part of your sign-up process, we actually asked if anyone had any questions up front, and we just wanted to deal with a couple of those straight away. So we'll typically pick a couple of these to kick off every webinar going forwards. The first one was from Josh, who was asking, are we going to look at a bit more of the contract side of things, the contract lifecycle management elements? The answer is yes, and that will be in our next webinar. We're a little unsure when that next webinar is going to be, end of October, early November, sometime around then. We're going to finish this session today on the vendor side, and then we're going to just go over to the contract review process, show you e-negotiate, show you a few more bits, and maybe a few of those key areas, James, that you just mentioned earlier on that we might not fit into this session because we've got a lot to go through. We'll cover that then. We also had a question from Kelly, and this was a really good and tough question. So if any of you have any insights around this, I would love to see those in the chat as we go through this. But Kelly asked, how do you keep people engaged? And it was quite a broad question. And we kind of took this as like, how do you keep people engaged, with your vendor and contract management processes using Gatekeeper? And like I said, it's a tough one to answer, and we're just going to give this a very quick go. And the way we look at this is there's three key areas. So pre-implementation, when you're looking at which sort of solutions you're going to use and why you're going to make some changes, it's really good to bring people along at the very start of this journey, because it does take a while for all of this to get going. You'll sort of have those early innovators, those evangelists at the start that you can work with to really start spreading the message for your business. Next, once you have your solution, so in this case, Gatekeeper, and you start implementing it, you'll still want to have all of those people, those evangelists, those early supporters alongside you, working with them to make the best processes possible, to make sure everything works for them, as well as it working for you, of course. And just getting a good feel for what they need, how they like it. Does the process have any blockers or any weird areas that doesn't quite work? You'll want to work really closely with these people. And then typically you'll have your business as usual. This is when you've implemented everything. And people fall into the trap here. They think this is when it gets easy. And if anything, this is when it becomes super difficult and a lot harder. You'll have those early sort of evangelists, those early supporters really on board, and you need to just get through the next lot of people within your organization. So you really need that support to continue spreading through. You really need to address people's concerns. If there's the intake form's a bit too long and not working and people are trying to circumvent that, address that, just be really on it. And over time, you'll just gradually go through it. I appreciate we don't have a lot of time to cover this, so that's a whistle-stop tour on one incredible and difficult question. Now we're trying to put out some more content around this in the future. James, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, that's a really good point. And I think that final piece of the puzzle you mentioned there around the users who you're trying to get that adoption from is the hardest one. And I think the first two sets of users you mentioned, the ones who are supporting or helping you build the process, you're doing all the work with them so that part 3 is as easy as possible. But it's still going to be difficult regardless of if you plan things perfectly or if you skipped a few steps. But that's hopefully what we're going to get through a few bits today, like building efficient processes.
Yes.
so that those non-early adopters are still sort of won over, and also things that you can do to make their life a little bit easier when they start using a new process.
Yeah. So Kelly, thank you for a super challenging question to kick us off. Really enjoyed thinking about that one. James, we are going to show something in a moment that will help keep people engaged, but I think we have a poll, and this is our kind of standard poll, which is all about really your level of knowledge. James, I'll give you a couple of seconds to find that poll if you can. If not, okay, there we go. Got it. Awesome. This is really just to understand your level of knowledge around workflows, specifically in Gatekeeper. We'll give this about 30 seconds. And James, you have Gatekeeper on screen.
Yep.
I kind of prompted you earlier on today. Could you just give us a little reminder of where everyone can find best practice workflows? And just for everyone on this webinar, best practice workflows are something James, the product team here at Gatekeeper have been working on last year predominantly, which allows you to set up a workflow within Gatekeeper within minutes. So we have process maps that we've kind of put together based on all of our ideas, expertise, and use cases we've seen, just to really speed up that process for you. James, could you, I'll hand it over to you here.
Yeah, I'll navigate over to the workflows menu here. And it's worth mentioning, the vendor onboarding workflow we've been building, as well as a few of the other ones we've dipped our toe into as we've been going through this webinar series, have all been the best practice workflows. So if there's one that's a business process or has a piece of functionality that you're interested in, there's nothing stopping you in your Gatekeeper environment coming to this page here, the workflows one, if you're a workflow administrator, if you have that user permission, of course, hitting add, and rather than choosing a fresh workflow, hitting workflow template. And then this will pop up a series of all those best practice workflows that we talked about with 2 options alongside each one. One is to actually hit create, and that will build that workflow framework with the form, the notifications, the phases, the transitions in there so that you're really close to having an operational business process just created from scratch. And then what you have alongside each of these as well is a setup guide link. And what this will do is take you to our knowledge base page, where you'll find for most of these workflows walkthroughs of like how it will work in the base version, as well as configuration steps to say this is how you can get it operational, and then also this is how you can tweak it based on how our clients use Gatekeeper. So adding extra reviews, adding extra teams to perform checks, adding extra custom data, things like that. But that's how you do it in the workflows page. Add workflow template.
Awesome, James. Cool. James, just quickly, your Zoom video is popping up. I think on the right-hand side occasionally. So if anyone just saw a couple of random rectangles there, it wasn't Gatekeeper, it's just James's Zoom, which seems to plague us every single time we have a call. But no worries.
I like to Zoom about that.
Yeah, it's weird that it pulls through onto the videos. Excellent. James, if you close the poll, I think I can't see anything so far on the results. So if you can.
I have closed it. Let me hit share now. So
that's great. Awesome. I can see this.
Split, isn't it?
Yeah, no, this is cool. We will hopefully have something for everyone And James, let's get going, because we're going to start off with emails here. And I believe we showed this right at the end of our last session on intake forms. So how can we pair email notifications and that entire suite within our workflows with the view to keep our colleagues and stakeholders engaged, much to Kelly's question?
Yeah, so we'll use the vendor onboarding workflow for this because we've been using it for everything else so far in this webinar series. And actually, now that you mention it, it's interesting you mentioned not just like the key stakeholder that I had in mind, which would be the requester of the contract or the new vendor, but just any colleagues and stakeholders. So it's a good point. Whilst I'm about to show some of this config, bear in mind that it's not just aimed at users who have submitted intake forms. It could be anyone that you want to keep updated about the progress of a particular new contract or new vendor onboarding, things like that. But the functionality, that I think we had about 30 to 60 seconds to rifle through this at the end of the last webinar, is CC notification emails. So in our Workflows 101 session, we talked about the fact that as cards move through the Kanban board like this, when they land at a particular phase, they will send out notifications to the key stakeholders who are generally, the notifications are when they are responsible for performing an action. So over here on this initial approvals phase, this will have notified the finance team and the vendor management team, because they have to review the form and they may have to do their own checks and things like that. But one thing that you can configure alongside this is not just who needs to do something, it's keeping people updated. And the one that I had in mind and I want to show is keeping the requester updated. And before I actually show this, the reason it's really important and something that some of our clients overlook from time to time is being those workflow administrators, those early adopters, if they are brought into the process during the configuration stages, they'll have a lot more understanding of like, what are all these steps of the process? When a card lands here, what does that mean? And also once it's live, they'll be able to see that global bird's eye view. But an end user, like someone who submits a vendor onboarding form, generally for them, if you don't configure anything, it might look like it's just dropped into a black hole and they have no idea what's going on from that point onwards. So the first CC notification email I want to bring up is this very first phase after the request form. So basically, if you want to configure a notification here, once a card has landed at this initial approvals phase, you can click to edit it as a workflow admin. You go to the notifications tab. And as you can see here, we have 2 notifications already enabled to those owners of this phase, those reviewers, the finance and vendor management teams. We've also got reminder emails just to ping them in case they haven't been as quick as they should. But one thing you can enable alongside these card owner notifications is emails back to the card creator. So what you would do here, if you want to give the requester that knowledge as to, yes, we've received your form, it's about to be reviewed by these people, and this is what happens next. You can come here, enable this email, simple as switching it on. And then in the email template, this is where you want to put that consideration into these people who are possibly using this for the first time. What should I be telling them when a card lands here? And what you should be configuring is, copy and pasted this, but I missed off the F. You should be giving them a nice subject line so that they know exactly, the nature of the email they're receiving. And in the body of this email, this is where by default,
James,
it will be empty. Sorry, Daniel. Yep.
Can I just jump in just real quick, just so we don't skim over it? But the card name element in the subject, in the brackets, what's the deal with that?
So that's a good point. I was going to skip over that, but this is basically a dynamic reference to the name of the workflow card. And I think when we talked about like intake forms, we talked about how an element of the form can become the identifying name of the card. Like if it's a vendor onboarding form, generally it'll be the name of the vendor. If it's a contract request form, it'll be the name of the contract, things like that. And if you want, what you can do is you can use these squiggly brackets and put card.name in them. And in the subject line that gets the email that gets sent to, the card creator in this case, or your key stakeholders at any point in the process, when they receive the email, without having to open it, read it, and then follow it into Gatekeeper, they'll instantly know which vendor it pertains to or which contract. So yeah, exactly. In this subject line, there's the confirmation form received, but also we're including the name of the vendor there so that the user knows which form they're receiving this for, if they're submitting lots, that is.
I'm just going to ask another follow-up to that. Can we just go down to the very bottom here? And and from memory, it's in the auxiliary. Just to show all the different variables, right? Like we've got a list of them here, right? Yeah.
There is a list.
I'm not sure how many people are aware that oh, there's a lot of options you can add that kind of automate the subject line or even the body of text that you want to use.
Yeah, and there's some useful, like, so card name, that's the one we've used there, and alongside the tag, it actually gives you like an example of the text that will come through. And I was about to post in some content just to show you like a good example, but there's also another feature behind this, clicking this option to reveal those tags. But let me just paste this in, and I'll hit this button again that will reload those tags. But also what this does, and again, it's one of those that I'm not sure of the users on this call if they're aware of this. Below these tags, if you've entered a body of your email, Gatekeeper will preview what this is going to look like to your end users. So if you've got those tags in there, and if you've got maybe special little formatting bits like I have as well, you'll see this is what they're going to come through like in the email body to a user. So that means you don't have to configure it and then like push a card onto it and send it to yourself. You can just check really quickly, what's this going to look like? Is it all working properly? So I wonder if have I included any other tags? I think I've included one more dynamic tag, and it is, yeah, the SLA due date. So did we talk about SLA dates in our last, in
It's
any
come
of our
up
previous
briefly
sessions?
throughout.
Yeah.
We've not really focused in too much on it, but the
Okay.
SLA is what we assign to a particular phase of how many days or hours we want that card to be completed in, right?
Exactly, like a deadline, basically. Exactly.
Yeah.
So this tag enter phase SLA due date basically means when a card lands here, Gatekeeper will check when is that deadline, and you can include that in the email. So if I scroll down, you'll see the email I've configured here gives that confirmation to the end user so that they know the form has been submitted successfully. Because again, if this is their first time doing it, they may not know for sure, has it been received? Has it dropped into a black hole? If I missed something, they'll know, okay, it's been submitted. I'm receiving this confirmation message. Then they get that update of what's going to happen next, and it gets reviewed by the vendor management team before we begin our onboarding tasks and risk assessments and so on. And then the actual SLA deadline hasn't dropped through into here, probably because I might not have configured one for this phase, but this sentence would have said the initial approval should be completed quickly and will be with your vendor no later than, and then, 1st of October or something like that, depending on what SLA timers you configure. There's also a follow-up bit here with a hyperlink. So this is a bit of complex config, but we'll link bits to our knowledge base after this if you want some information on how to do this. This gives that user some information on, if they are interested in it, they don't have to sit back and wait for the next notification email to come to them. They can go and track it, and it'll give them a link to a specific place for that. This one is directing the user to the employee portal dashboard, so the submit request dashboard. And if I follow this link here, you'll see this just takes me into Gatekeeper, where I can find my previous requests. But if you'd prefer to direct them to maybe the actual Kanban board itself, or somewhere else in Gatekeeper where they'll be able to view requests or contracts and things like that, you can include it. And then just, if you have questions, you can use the messaging feature on the workflow card, reach out to a member of the admin team. So just some simple steps and guidance so that users know it's been received and what they can expect to happen in future, or what they can actually do to interact with the process.
Yeah,
I missed anything there, Daniel?
No, that was good. That was good.
Okay.
Let's move on for sure.
Okay, so I'll save that one now.
James, I'm just going to be really, really awkward here. This is why we need Lucy here. Can we just go back into those settings, because there's just a couple of bits that I just want to focus on here at the bottom, which is the view form button part.
Oh, yeah.
Can you just explain this area and what that enables?
So every workflow notification generally will come with like a button, like a big orange one at the bottom that gives a user a link to something. It can either give them a link to the actual vendor or the contract in the repository if you want to take them there. But generally, the one that it defaults to most of the time, because it's a workflow notification, is the Kanban workflow card. So for this button that will appear at the bottom of the form for your users, the link that they follow alongside this one, so that you can include multiple links, but the big button at the bottom will take them back to the workflow card. So if they want to check, maybe have any updates been made to the data that I provided, have any risk assessments been completed, have all the approvals been compiled, things like that, they can follow this link. And what you can also do is you can customize the text, because by default, as you'll see here, it just says view form, but you could put check up on your form. don't know why you put a question mark, but you can include that as the button text instead. And that's just how it would appear to your users instead of just view form. But yeah, so you can customize that as well, alongside the content of the email and the subject of the email. So there's a few bits you can tweak there depending on what you think your users will engage with best. If they like emojis, if they like buttons, if they like links, go wild.
Yeah, it's a good overview for sure there. And like you've already mentioned employee portal. This is almost more important, I would say, for people who don't have an employee portal because they have no way for their requesters to track the status. Like you've just shown the employee portal there, it clearly tracks the various phases.
Oh, definitely. This is definitely more
with the
important.
pills, right? So if you don't have employee portal, the best way to keep your users updated is just to automate those notifications and put as much information in a concise fashion so they actually read it, which is also an art form. But no, that's great, James. What did you want to cover next on this area?
So now that we've talked about like how you configure that, I just want to cover the other simple like must-have notification email that you should be configuring. So we've talked about the initial one to confirm to your users they've done the job right. They've submitted a form, it's been received. This is what happens next. I'm going to scoot right to the end of this vendor onboarding workflow now and show that we can do the same thing on a done phase. So where the process has been, all the reviews and all the onboarding forms have been completed, everything's marked as done. You can do the same thing here. So I'm going to edit the phase and show the notifications tab. This one's already been configured. It's been enabled to the card creator. And if I click to edit this one, we'll see this one's already got the same things that we saw before. So the name of the vendor, and then it'll say vendor onboarding completed with some tick marks. And then this includes another dynamic tag. So this will mention the recipient's name at the top, and it'll say your vendor onboarding form has been fully approved and completed. And then maybe give them some next steps to say, now that you've done this, this is what can happen next. So this one says you can now begin contract negotiations with them. And then it just says, thanks for your patience and cooperation. And the same thing again, it's got a view form button at the bottom. So they're the two really simple ones you should consider for your workflows to keep your requesters up to date on the big milestones like submitted and then completed. But obviously you can take this same functionality and just apply it to any other key, what you might call milestones in the process.
James, it's a good point in terms of focusing on those key phases, because depending on how you have Gatekeeper set up, right, you've got 3 collapsed phases there that would all happen rather instantaneously if a card moved through there. And you probably don't want to have 3 emails associated with those, because you will end up spamming everyone within your business, and they won't like that. So focus on the key ones, and you'll be in a good position.
Exactly. You've got to pick your moments. Like, even though this is a relatively short workflow, there's only a few of those card creator emails, because exactly like you said, you don't want to be spamming them like it's reached this phase, it's reached phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. You just want the cliff notes, basically, the important parts. And actually that brings me to this next step here. So basically this is what some people might consider, an important stage when the form has been passed to that vendor to complete their onboarding and risk assessments and so on. But on this phase, I haven't necessarily enabled the initial card creator email. I've enabled a reminder, and I'll just go under the hood and look at the config to explain that. So when a card lands here, this would normally be where this email would send if you want to keep that card creator updated to say your intake form has been approved and now it's with the vendor. But in this case, to avoid that exact scenario you just mentioned there, Daniel, of like spamming people, like they don't want to know, they might not care that much. They might only want to see, or if they want a deep dive, they can go and find it in their own dashboards, and they can find it on the Kanban board. But this card creator email is letting them know, maybe because they might have actually an action to perform here. So you can see the config arrangement we've got here is the card creator is not notified when the card lands here. They're notified if the card has been sat here for 7 days. And in that scenario, you might be assuming that maybe the vendor has forgotten to fill it out. Maybe they've gotten confused and been talking with the requester offline, and then maybe again forgotten to come into Gatekeeper to complete it. But in this notification email, what we've got is similar content that we saw before. So that a dynamic tag along with a subject line to let them know what's going on. So this is an FYI, there's been an onboarding delay, and it's letting them know the vendor request form's been with the vendor for 7 days without a response. And it just says, if this is an unexpected delay, actually, let me hit submitted preview so it's a bit easier to read at the bottom here. If it's an unexpected delay, you might want to reach out to them and check, are they actually working on it? Have they hit a roadblock where there's some fields they don't know how to complete, or they are waiting on internal feedback to complete, things like that. And then there's another deadline here, but the deadline hasn't filled itself in on this email, but it says if no response is received by X date, an SLA transition will kick this card forward and the vendor might lose their chance to complete the form, which could lead to then further delays. And, it made it sound a bit threatening here to say this
You
might
made it sound terrifying, James.
Yeah, you won't be able to work with this vendor. We might deny operations with them because they're not cooperating in Gatekeeper. But any sort of message you want to put here, it could be really harsh, or it could be just a slight warning.
Gentle reminder.
Could be useful. A gentle reminder, exactly.
Gentle reminder. Yes.
So this is something again that you can provide as an update to your requesters.
But in short, in this entire area, you've got a lot of options. You can talk to the vendor as well. From this, you can talk to a workflow group, which I know we've definitely gone through in, I think, the custom data session we did in the visibility area. So you've got a lot of options as to who you want to communicate. For example, like when I was using this, most of this would just go back to the procurement team, and we would just try and work with our vendors to get them moving that way, right? So you've got a lot of different options. No, James, that was super, super useful. James, I think we should probably move on to the next section now, if that's okay, unless there's anything burning for you to cover off in this area.
There isn't. No, I was actually just going to say exactly what you just said. Rather than enabling the card creator, the vendor management team could be the ones that are notified in case of a delay, depending on who owns the relationship at this point in your life cycle whilst you're onboarding them. Should it still be the main key stakeholder, or should it be the vendor management team? You can enable that same late, delayed response to the same group. Yeah.
No, that's great, James. I think, do we have another poll here?
Yes, we do. Let me pull that up.
Excellent. So this poll is all around your approach to getting successful adoption of your processes, your ways of working, your use of Gatekeeper. Just intrigued to see how you're communicating with your colleagues and your wider stakeholders. And this is kind of all inspired by Kelly. So Kelly, if you're on this or if you're watching this back, I really appreciate your question because it got us thinking there. Cool. James, have you got that poll up? I can't see it.
I'm trying to launch it, but I'll need to end the last one. My bad.
Cool. That's all right.
Next one.
I don't envy you having to manage all the polls as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah,
that's great.
I miss Lucy.
That's yeah, for sure. So we're just gonna leave that for maybe 30 seconds, and maybe I'll just set you up to move along, because I'm very aware of the time here, and I'm just worried we'll miss out on some of this cool stuff we're going to show. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite features, and I can remember when I was a Gatekeeper user, just came out a couple months after I implemented it, and I got to change all my workflows, and since then it's just got better. So we're going to focus on conditional approvals next, James.
Yep.
Let's end the poll now. Okay. And then I will ask you
as well. So there's a lot of selections here. Okay. So...
Nice. Great. Okay. Workshops, mass emails, live training seminars. That's nice to see, for sure.
That's the popular one. That's interesting.
Super encouraging, actually, to see a lot of sort of people-to-people communication, workshops, live training, seminars. Excellent. Awesome. Thanks for everyone for taking part in that. So, James, firstly, could you explain what conditional approvals are? And I'm very aware, and you'll know this, that Gatekeeper has a language of its own sometimes. So let's go for a plain language definition where possible here.
Sure. I want to do something before I jump into this definition, because this came up. Someone asked specifically, I don't know if they used the term conditional approvals. His name was Alan. Am I allowed to say their surname?
Alan.
I'll just say Alan asked a question on the last webinar. We didn't really have time to dive into it, but I want to mention that as a result of Alan asking that question, in the footer of the webinar that we uploaded to our knowledge base, we actually recorded a little walkthrough explaining the specific scenario that he asked about. So if you do have questions, or you have ideas, or you're trying to implement something yourself, just like Alan was, by all means, stick that in the chat or ask a question, because even if we don't get to it, like I said, we can try and add it into the agenda for what we're talking about today, maybe a future webinar, or we can do what we did with Alan's scenario here, record him a little video to go on the knowledge base, because it might be the case that you aren't the first person to wonder if it's possible in Gatekeeper, and other people might benefit from you asking that question. But okay, conditional parallel approvals. I'm going to jump into what I've called a long vendor onboarding workflow here to show you a simple scenario and talk about one maybe that Daniel might have remembered where parallel approvals or conditional parallel approvals didn't exist. And I apologize if I use those two terms interchangeably. They're part of the same vernacular here at Gatekeeper. So an approval on a workflow is a very simple action. It's generally something that you'll probably be familiar with already for your contract and vendor management processes. Before getting everything executed and marking it all as like risk approved and things like that, you'll want certain people to see the data and the documents you've collated and specifically note that they approve to proceed. And that's what approvals in Gatekeeper are. So I'll take you under the hood to show you what simple approvals look like if you're configuring these. So on this long vendor onboarding workflow here, I've got phases that represent all the different approvals I would need to collect to get a vendor from the left-hand side of the board where they've just been requested to the right-hand side where they're marked as done, and the notification gets sent back to that requester. And clicking onto a phase, the way that I've configured this is when a card lands here, approval is enabled, which means that the owner of the card, when it lands at this phase, has to click approve or reject, depending on their choice. And if I navigate over to the transitions tab, which we'll come back to later when we're showing some more advanced config, based on that approval, so you can see what I've configured here, if the card is approved, Gatekeeper will move that card to the next phase of the process. That's simple approval, basically. Card lands at a phase. Yep.
Just to add one, just little reminder here for everyone. Can you just show the ownership of the phase as well? So you just mentioned, just to make sure, just to bring it all together in one area here.
Sure. So who have I given access to own this phase? It's the InfoSec team on this particular phase, but it could be a team, could be an individual. It's up to you how you configure it. And what?
And therefore, so it is the InfoSec team that has the ability to approve on this phase.
Yes. Technically, excellent. I do as well because I'm a global workflow admin, but the way that workflows usually work is someone from that team has to be the one to open up the form and hit approve. Exactly.
Excellent. Appreciate that.
So that's the background. That's what approvals are. Really simple. Just an action to perform that will then move the card along to the next action that someone performs. The reason I've called this a long vendor onboarding is because let's say this is might be quite a big process depending on who we've got on the call. If you do have like lots of different teams that need to collaborate before you start working with a new partner, or maybe it's just the vendor management team who makes that decision. What you can do is you can give each approval a phase so that Gatekeeper will land here. The InfoSec team is notified, they review it, they hit approve. This is like hazardous materials and operations or something.
Yeah.
They'll receive a notification, they'll have to do that. Data protection officers, ESG and sustainability, CFO and finance. This is the way that you can configure it. And some of our clients, when they come to Gatekeeper, want to do things this way because generally that's how they've worked, right? Like you will, if you're working in a non-digital operation, maybe you're using physical paper to collect information around the vendors you're working with, it might be the case that only one person can be checking details about that at a time, right? So this sort of is a digital representation of an iterative process where one person reviews and approves, then the next, and then the next. One of the downsides of this that you might be able to quickly infer is that it could take a long time, hence the name long vendor onboarding. If the InfoSec team takes 2 weeks to approve, and then the COSHH team takes 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks, this is obviously worst case. They shouldn't be taking that long. This could be a 3-month just approval gauntlet for the vendor to go through. And in that time, the requester is getting impatient. The vendor might be wondering why they can't start their operations with you. And yeah, if there's any bottlenecks, they can really slow the process down. So what you can configure is what we call conditional parallel approvals, where you take these there's 5 approvals in this case, and you smush them all into one. So each of these key stakeholders, each of these teams or individuals will be notified at the same time. They'll be able to see the form at the same time. And just the time that it takes to approve, let's assume they all take 2 weeks again, is just the time of the longest person. So max 2 weeks in this case, but hopefully still shorter. So that's what we mean by conditional or parallel approvals, where you're taking lots of different stakeholders who need to provide that approval for a form to proceed and just allowing them to access it at the same time.
Yeah, that was a good overview. Can you show this how this works?
Yes, I can. So this is the long vendor onboarding. And before I leave, I want to highlight one more point about how this is not as good as conditional parallel, is that especially considering this is only 5 and this is taking up my whole screen. If your process is deployed successfully, so imagine like 6 months down the line, more teams are wanting to get involved. Maybe you've got extra departments. Maybe you add in an ESG executive who needs to review things. The CEO wants to be involved. Each phase is just going to add time. And also, as a workflow admin, as yourself, it's going to make it harder to oversee where cards are. Like you could zoom out so you can fit more on your screen, but what would be far easier is what we're about to show. So if I navigate out of this workflow now and go to my good vendor onboarding, we'll see this one's a lot shorter, but as soon as the vendor onboarding form is completed, we have a single onboarding review phase. And the way this one works is on the approvals tab, rather than just enabling approval and leaving it as is, we switch it over and we say, actually, there's going to be more than one, so parallel approvers at this phase. And what we can do is start configuring the rules and the scenarios behind when they should always be approving. So there's actually 2 types here. One is just pure parallel, and one is conditional parallel. So Daniel, please interrupt me if I'm just using too much like jargon, but hopefully
so let's just maybe cover those 2 different options, right? So maybe just start off with the more perceivably complex and talk about what conditional means within Gatekeeper.
Sure. So conditional means, and this actually lends itself back to what you were saying around making sure your intake form sets up a good process.
That's right.
Conditional means where basically you're taking something about the form, some piece of data that's in there, and you're using it to decide should this particular, in this case, approval be required. And there's a conditional rule set here that says, here's the InfoSec team. They are a conditional approver, so they're not always needed for every single vendor that we're taking through the process. But in the scenario that the requester, back on the request form near the start of the workflow, said, will they require access to our infrastructure data in their services to us? If they answered yes to that question, then the InfoSec team are needed. If that question in the form is no, or I think there was an option for NA when we were configuring it, if it's basically anything but yes, the InfoSec team won't be assigned, they won't need to approve, and they won't be notified. So in that case, you can make sure that processes run a lot quicker, and it's the same sort of thing about spamming people. The InfoSec team wouldn't be very happy if they had to approve window cleaners and stationary providers, as well as your actual proper IT infrastructure partners and things like that. It'd be a waste of time for them.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of conditional rules within Gatekeeper. It really lets you tailor your process, get the right people involved at the correct time, which is a big one. Simple approval rule set here. Explain that one. This is much simpler.
Sure. So the non-conditional but still parallel approvals are basically where you add the teams or people that need to be approving, but you don't assign any conditions. So basically, when a card lands at this onboarding review phase, the CSG sustainability team is going to be notified, the contract management team is going to be notified, and the vendor management team. They're all going to have to provide approval, regardless of what the vendors or what the vendor or what the requester put in the form. So that these ones will always want to be performing reviews about all new partners or vendors that are being onboarded. However, the below ones, the conditional ones, InfoSec and finance in this case, sometimes are needed, sometimes are not. So there's the contrast there. You can have always required approvals alongside conditional ones. And I think I could just push some cards through to basically show that happening live as well. Let me just go back to the workflow. Yeah, so I've got 2 partners here. One is a SaaS vendor, and I'm just going to manually move this. And just as an FYI, I don't know if many users know about this.
Yeah, please show this.
If you're a workflow admin, not many of our users know about this. If you're a workflow admin and especially if you're testing, this is really useful. Or maybe if something's been misconfigured in your process and you need to get around it, you have access to this control tab. And what you can do is you can just move a card to a phase that you want it to go to avoid having to like drag it around the board and things like that. So just for your workflow admins out there, if you want to do some quick testing and push cards around like I'm about to, you can use this move option. So I'm going to move a SaaS vendor over there, and I'm also going to move a shipping partner over there, and they should get different approvers. I think I filled out the forms differently, but I'll open them up once we're over there.
Just 2 things. Firstly, anyone who has questions, I think I've seen a couple of hands raised. Please just ask those questions in the Q&A, which is on your bottom taskbar. I don't know what it's called in Zoom. Let's just go with taskbar and or toolbar. please use the Q&A function there, and we'll get your questions answered either live or after the event. And James, when you do that force move, does it show up in the history to show that you forced that move? One thing I'm always a bit of a stickler for is that audit trail, because I've dealt with too many auditors that will pick you up on just anything. So yeah, cool.
Yeah. Not only does it confirm that I did it and exactly when, it gives you this little icon to let you know it's not just a standard, it's someone manually dragging a card around. Because the design of a workflow is that transitions based on users completing their actions will automatically move cards. This little icon here lets you know it's actually been someone playing around with it, like an admin like me. So yeah, that just show up in the history in case you're worried about things being lost information
just on the history as well. That will also show any approval comments once someone actually approves it, right? So you have that entire history of approvals from these various, well, potentially all of these showing up.
Yeah. But what you can see here is, and yeah, the form is visible here, which is great. But that InfoSec question around whether or not this vendor, which is a SaaS vendor, so this is expected, will need access to our data or systems, because they answered yes, we've got 4 approvals here. Those 3 always active: CSG, contract management, and vendor management. But the InfoSec team are also needed. Whereas if we go down to up to our shipping partner, because the user answered no there, we only have the standard 3. We only need those 3 approvers to provide their approval for the card to move on and the vendor onboarding to be completed in this case. But yeah, this is the good way to do things. And I think I've referenced this one of your podcast episodes, didn't I, Daniel, with Datadog, where they talked about
Michelle.
She does this with all her processes now, because even though that historically they might have done things linearly because maybe they didn't want the legal team to be looking at contracts before the vendor had been risk assessed, the amount of time they saved by doing everything in parallel far outweighed the amount of time they actually had to say no to a vendor, and maybe the legal team's time was wasted. They looked at it pragmatically and they saw the time saved is just, it makes sense to build the process around the actual around the rule rather than the exception or the worst case scenario.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that approach. It's something that I have used in previous roles, which is whilst you're vendor onboarding, you're also negotiating the contracts, or even whilst you're still sourcing, you're negotiating contracts. So you don't lose all that leverage on the contracts when that one vendor knows you are going to choose them. It gives them a little bit of an upper edge against you at times. So yeah, much to what Michelle said from Datadog, don't let the exceptions dictate what you do. And yeah, this is much, I much prefer this than running sequentially. James, I was just hoping, could you just show what it looks like when you approve something? I'm not sure if you were planning on doing that, but I think it's always just good to show what an approval looks like.
I'm gonna have to hit approve 3 times now, but yeah, I can.
Just do it the once, please. Yeah, once is fine. Once is fine. Just to show.
So when a user logs in, and this is going to be a different experience to a regular end user because I'm a global admin, but if a user logs in and they are a member of the vendor management group or the contract management group or the CSG and ESG group, CSR and ESG group, when they hit approve, they'll see that Gatekeeper says you're approving on behalf of vendor management. But like I said, because I belong to all 3 of these and I'm a global admin, I can choose who I'm approving on behalf of, and they'll be able to input their comments to say like they're happy with it, or like when they checked it over, things like that, if they want to apply details to that. But when they approve, this form updates and we can see it says there's one out of 3 being received, who approved it, along with a timestamp there. And like you said as well, Daniel, in the history, it logs which users have interacted with that as well. So not only on the form at the current phase does it show you what the current status is, if I want to go back and see, oh, well, who approved this vendor on behalf of the ESG team, I'll be able to see that in the card history there too. It's really easy to find.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
And back to that transition that we looked at on the long vendor onboarding form. When if a card is approved, it moved. You'll have noticed this card didn't move because Gatekeeper needs all 3 of these to be captured before the card can actually be progressed. It can't just be one out of the 3. Every different stakeholder needs to visit this card and hit approve before the card will move.
Yeah, James, we were talking briefly about this, and I offered you up maybe a slightly out there view as to why I really love this, is that you don't want to be that one approver that's not approved when everyone else can see the approval status. So like if you're in here and your CFO's in here, or someone from the C-suite or someone more seniors in here, and they're waiting on you to get in and approve it, it gives you let's say, an added incentive not to be the last one or the person holding this up.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really like the visibility it brings to the approval process. Typically, prior to Gatekeeper, you would have probably used email and things like that to gain approvals, and you're kind of just waiting for those emails to come back to you before you store them in SharePoint. It's much simpler, and everyone else can see the status of that. So yeah, big fan of this.
It removes those silos as well, right? Especially, and that can happen in Gatekeeper workflows. If things are taking place in all these different phases of a process, then the CFO might not know that the InfoSec team took 3 months to get around to addressing. I'm really painting a worst case scenario, but they might not know that it's taken that long because they weren't notified until the card landed with them. However, like, yeah, if you said if all 5 groups can see the card at the same time, and it's always like the same one that takes till last, they'll start, hopefully that shame will overpower them there, and they'll see, well, all these other people can see that I'm taking the longest. Maybe I shouldn't drag my heels on this approval.
Yeah, I definitely think there's something to that. Excellent.
Yeah.
Awesome. James, is there anything else you wanted to show around conditional parallel approvals?
Yeah, two things actually.
Awesome.
One thing I just remembered a second ago, because I'm trying to cast my mind back to when we were talking about not the admins who are benefiting from this process here, and also the approvers who are benefiting by just getting everything up front, like without having to wait for all the other groups. On the submit request dashboard, if you have employee portal, shorter workflows pay dividends here too. So and some of these workflows are named horribly, so I apologize if this is hard to read. But if I'm an end user, for instance, and I've initiated a vendor onboarding request, and we can see I've got one here, here's my new IT partner that I've initiated a vendor onboarding request for. These, I think we call them pills, are basically the progress counters to see how far it is through a process. And if you hit view more, users can see here as well, like the names of these pills and like the phases on the workflow that it has to go. If I saw that my request had gone through the vendor onboarding form, but still had like 6 phases left to go in the workflow, that's one of those stimuluses for me to think this is going to take a long time and this is a lot of red tape. Whereas if I saw my regular vendor onboarding request and hit view more, I saw, oh, this is a really short workflow. I've got a vendor request form, approvals, a vendor onboarding form, and then basically just an onboarding review before it's done. And I can also see the specific teams that are responsible for this as well. So this is a much nicer way to allow your users to keep themselves updated. If you keep a workflow shorter, it's not just easier for you as a workflow admin or your business to keep things moving quickly. A user that wants to actually keep track of where things are won't have to read through like 10 different phases to find out what's left to go through for all their cards that they're submitting.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that. James, I'm super conscious of time because we are slowly running out of time. And I do want to give the option for some Q&A if there is there. Is there anything burning on conditional approvals, conditional parallel approvals?
One more minor story, minor anecdote. So this was actually a really like light bulb moment for me. So when I was on a client site once way back when, and we were giving live training to the end users, these are people that hadn't seen the process yet. This was going to be a new task for them to adopt. It was a vendor onboarding workflow as well, so it's super relevant for this. The concept of Gatekeeper calculating and automatically assigning approvers and teams was one that was really well received. So there's a gentleman that was sat there who's up until this point diligently taking notes and looking very stressed about all of the things he had to remember about what was going to happen. When this sort of phase occurred where Gatekeeper was automatically assigning approvals, he raised his hand and said, so I don't need to go and check our SOPs or draft any emails to all these different teams anymore. And the immediate answer was no. Gatekeeper finds out who's needed, notifies them, and they will just come to the workflow and provide approval. And so he sat back and relaxed, and he had that light bulb moment of, oh, at this point, I understand Gatekeeper is making my life easier. And this is something that I could tell at that point, he wasn't going to be one of those users that tries to circumvent the process, because it actually was improving his life. Not only was the intake form dynamic, it was the case that later in the workflow, it was doing tasks for him and doing them quite smart as well. And I think another one of you, it was another bank that you spoke to on a podcast recently, Daniel, that mentioned they
potentially
Monzo, that's it. Sorry, mentioned a competitor there, but they mentioned something similar, that their users love the idea of when they kick off a request, seeing things like, oh, the system's going to do this for you, because they're like, wow, this is actually, it's the 21st century. Technology is actually doing stuff that isn't just admin. It's working for me and getting these boxes ticked in the background. So another one of those cool things, if you can show your users, look at all these cool things the system will do based on you filling out some form details, it's one of those elements that can help them buy into the process a bit.
Yeah,
That's
definitely.
it.
James,
Sorry, I'm done.
no, it's cool. We're going to skip I think we had a third poll. I'm going to say we skip that. We can ask that another time because I want to get on to transitions, and we're talking about conditional transitions, just to throw that term conditional in again. I'm going to ask you quickly in plain language to explain that. And if it's easier just to start showing it off,
Yeah.
I'm game for that as well.
Sure. I might try and configure one real quick as well then. So maybe because I've configured conditional transitions on the vendor onboarding workflow, but I haven't done them on the contract request one. So I'll show a basic transition, and then I'll show you how you can make them a bit smarter. So we talked about transitions already. Basically, as a Kanban board, cards move through it like Trello or any other app that, uses the Kanban methodology where cards represent something like a contractor or a vendor. However, the way that Gatekeeper works is you want those cards to move on their own. You don't want users to have to, review a contract draft or fill out a form, hit save, and then manually drag it to where it needs to go, because also that relies on them understanding all the elements of the process and it could go wrong. So what you can configure in Gatekeeper, and so for instance, this is a really simple one, is when a user completes their task, and so this is a contract request form, on the transitions tab, you can see when the card is submitted, it's going to go to the initial review. This is a really simple transition. What you can then do, though, is you can say sometimes cards shouldn't always go the same route through a workflow. So I might have lots of phases on a workflow like this, a contract approval workflow, that maybe I should skip from time to time, or maybe cards should take a different pathway through. And so what you can do, rather than just using this simple rule, you can say, actually, I'm going to set up some conditional transitions. And in order to do that, you would say conditional. And rather than just having a single, I think it's called a radio button to select where a card goes, you can start building out different rules that Gatekeeper will try and apply to a card when it's moving. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say low value contract. I'm going to call this low value contract. And I can never type when I'm in a rush.
This is, and what you're doing here, James, just to clarify, setting up that category that houses all the rules. So you have as many of these as you want, and each one houses the various different conditions which you're about to add.
Yeah, so each phase can have either simple transitions like this one just did, or you can start building up exactly a library of rules that Gatekeeper will try and apply it'll check the form, it'll check the information on that card and say, if this transition should be used, I'll push the card over here. But if not, I'll try this other one and push the card over here. So when you're building a conditional transition like this, you want to say, when this one is valid, where should I put it? And because this is a low value contract one, as in this example, I'm going to say it should skip the initial review, because maybe an initial review isn't needed because there's no elements of budget, or there's no element of like,
maybe it's our terms, maybe it's so low risk. We just want to get a signature on this one.
What I'm going to do is
you can tailor this to whatever process policies that you're following within your business. So it gives you a lot of options.
And there's two elements you need to start building out in the conditions. The first is the action that stimulates the card to move. So same as what we just saw, I'm going to say when the card is submitted, I'm going to add a rule to say, this is a really typical example. I'm going to say if the annual value is less than, what's a low value for a contract? 10,000. And once I've created,
all depends.
It depends on your thresholds. So I'm going to say, now I'm happy with that transition and I want Gatekeeper to check it first. So I'm going to drag it to the top. So how these conditional transitions work is Gatekeeper will check the first one. If that one's not true, so if the value is over 10,000, it'll be like, nope, can't use that. And it'll go to the one under it until it eventually finds a transition that works and it kicks the card to that phase.
James, so just quickly on the low value contract inside of that, it was originally on pipeline, right, on transition status, and you do have to turn it to live make sure that it comes into effect.
This is in case you're like building out, maybe you have thresholds, like you might have 0 to 10,000, 10,000 to 20,000. If you're building those out and playing around with them and you're not ready for them to start working yet, you can leave them in pipeline and Gatekeeper won't check them when it's pushing cards through the workflow. But when you want Gatekeeper to start looking at a transition rule to start trying to apply it to any cards moving through your board, that you have to set it to live exactly. Otherwise it just won't work. So for instance, I have a card on here. Let me just see the value of this contract, 3,500. So that's under that threshold where usually it would go through an initial review. But because this is a low value contract, when this is submitted, it's disappeared from the board, probably because it's auto-created a contract. It's jumped ahead, but we can see it's now past this initial review. The line manager or whoever didn't have to review it, and it's going to try and create a contract draft for this particular agreement. So you can see that's basically how you can use those. And I'm just going to preempt your question here, Daniel. That also applies itself in the history as well. So when you want to see why is the card taking a particular path through a workflow, you're able to check, oh, well, James submitted the card and then this transition name fired. So I can see that's why it moved to the particular phase that it did. So that's a bit of the background there as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think maybe like a word of warning somewhat here in a very positive way is that you can do as many transitions as you want, but just bear in mind that you have to maintain these transitions over time. So if you start playing around with different phases and things like that, can impact on your transitions. So just be cognizant of the amount of work that you'll need to accommodate if just workflow management and your process management there. But it's a really cool feature. James, was there anything else you wanted to show on conditional transitions? I'm more than happy to come back to conditional transitions a little bit in the next session. We are planning on working on the contract workflow somewhat more, just to really focus on that contract management element as well.
I mean, there's obviously other use cases that can be demonstrated there. So for instance, on this vendor onboarding workflow, I had configured some where, for instance, after this initial approval, it could be the case that depending on maybe the categorization that the vendor management team assigned to a vendor, in this example, let me open this one up. You can see this is going to kick a vendor onboarding card straight through to vendor onboarded, where no tasks really need to be completed because they might have categorized it as transactional. It's a very low touch vendor. There's no element of like risk assessments that need to be done, maybe because it's the kind of vendor that wouldn't be required to complete them, or just are so simple that we can start working with them instantly. There's no element of real risk to our operations there. So you can build them into any sort of process where someone should be told, go through the vendor onboarding request form, but then again, Gatekeeper can automate the level of involvement that particular card or the complexity that the process needs to be followed there. So it's a nice one to pair alongside things like conditional approvals. So you can include extra steps or exclude particular steps depending on what's involved in a new relationship.
And to come full circle, all of this is fundamentally based on that intake form at the start. So if you set your intake form up as best as possible, and you have that end-to-end vision of your process when you're designing your processes out or using the best practice workflows initially, you get it right at the start. You can do all of this cool stuff throughout the entire process and just make things much easier for yourselves and all of your colleagues. More than happy to take any questions. I appreciate we're like 2 minutes just before we said we'd finish this. James and I were a little bit unsure if we would be able to fit all of this in. There were a couple other areas that we haven't quite got to, that we didn't think we'd get to, that we're going to show in the next session, where we will spend a lot more time in the contract review workflow, because I appreciate we're a vendor contract lifecycle management platform, and we've spent a lot of time on the vendor side. We really want to give some love to the contract management side, especially as that's the area I have a little bit of a bias towards. But if you have any questions, let us know in the chat. You can email us afterwards as well. You can email your CSMs. You can message myself or James direct, and we'll get back. James, was there, just in case any questions come in, was there anything else you wanted to say before? Because I know you've always got something to say. Maybe was there one thing that we missed?
I do want to be respectful. There is one feature that I want to mention that pairs itself nicely with these parallel approvals. So this workflow isn't necessarily the most complex one. We've only really built this with a few different form sections, but it does really lend itself well if we're thinking about that long vendor onboarding that I built that had loads of different approvals and reviews. Like it had InfoSec, it had DPO, it had finance, and so on. If you have long workflow forms like that, one thing that you can configure in the background is not just who conditionally should be viewing a particular workflow card when it lands on that phase, but what they should be able to see. And what I mean by that is, let me see if I've got an example here. This form has a vendor InfoSec questionnaire. And if I am a member of maybe the finance team or the ESG team, and there's maybe 20 form sections or a large number in this card, there are some that I would just see as clutter and I wouldn't want to see them. So I don't know if many of our clients or attendees on this webinar know about this, but what you can do is a bit like the conditions that we set up earlier, you can say who should be able to see a particular section of the form. And the way that I've configured this, it's really simple. I've just said the visibility for this form section, this InfoSec questionnaire should be read-only, but only to the InfoSec team, because they're the ones that are going to need to perform their risk reviews and perform tasks based on it. But for everyone else, set it to hidden, because like I said, those other groups, if they've got their own reviews to perform, they don't want to have to wade through 20 sections of data to find what's relevant to them. So this is one element where you can configure not just conditional parallel things, that are conditional approvals that are going on in parallel, but also if you are considering the experience for those people who are providing those approvals, make sure you're considering, you know, what they need to see to actually do their job, and apply that consideration to form section settings like this. Sorry,
Yeah,
that
James,
was really quick.
No. We'll definitely go over this more detail in the next session. We'll build some of these live for you to show you, because like to your point, James, this really pairs up with that conditional transitions that you just showed. Like it's all well getting the transitions right, if someone lands on that phase and they've got loads of stuff to read through that maybe isn't applicable to them. I appreciate that some teams maybe want the wider context of, you know, everything. The vendor management team, largely one of those. Sometimes the InfoSec team will want to see everything as well, just to build that risk profile. But for some of the others, they're not too concerned. So this works really, really well. James, appreciate you running through a lot of config and dealing with my questions throughout. And
pleasure.
to everyone that's attended, really appreciate your time, your attention. Thanks for coming along. I think the next one will probably be early November. Just we've got a few calendar clashes, a few events and things like that we're trying to work around to get the next success hours out. But if you have any questions in the meantime, please reach out to your CSMs or myself, James. Just email us and we'll get back to you with as much information as possible. But yeah, see you hopefully in sort of 5-6 weeks time for another success hours.
Thanks so much, everyone.
See ya.